Elena Carter had never been afraid of the dark. She had walked these streets countless times after finishing her shift at the Blue Orchid, the upscale bar where she worked to cover her college tuition. But tonight, something felt off. The city was quieter than usual at 2:00 a.m. The air was thick with humidity, a storm brewing in the distance. The neon lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty sidewalks. Elena wrapped her leather jacket tighter around herself, her boots clicking softly against the pavement. She wasn't a paranoid person, but the prickling sensation at the back of her neck wouldn't go away. It was that deep instinctual warning, the kind that told prey when a predator was near. Her apartment wasn't far, just 4 blocks down. She quickened her pace, gripping her bag strap. The Blue Orchid wasn't in the safest part of the city, but she had always been careful, never taken shortcuts, never let herself get too distracted. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, measured, keeping perfect rhythm with her own. Her pulse spiked. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just another late-night worker heading home. But when she turned a corner and suddenly heard the footsteps speed up, closing the distance, her stomach twisted. Elena didn't hesitate. She bolted. She sprinted down the street, heart hammering, breath coming in sharp gasps. She could hear them chasing her now, the pounding of heavy boots against the pavement. She reached into her bag, fingers fumbling for the pepper spray she always carried. Too late. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, jerking her backward so fast that she barely had time to scream. Another hand clamped over her mouth, muffling her cry as she kicked and thrashed. Elena Carter, a deep voice, murmured against her ear, dark amusement lacing his tone. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Panic exploded in her chest. How did they know her name? She bit down, hard, on the hand covering her mouth. The man let out a harsh curse, but his grip didn't loosen. "She's a fighter," another voice muttered. Not for long. The world tilted as something cold and metallic pressed against her neck. A needle. She barely had time to register what was happening before the burning sensation hit her bloodstream. Her limbs went numb. Her body betrayed her. The last thing she saw was a black SUV pulling up to the curb, its door swinging open like a hungry beast. Then, darkness. Elena woke to pain. Her skull throbbed. Her tongue felt like sandpaper. Her body was sluggish, unresponsive. Whatever drug they had used still lingered in her system. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Then the cold. She was lying on a concrete floor, her wrists and ankles shackled with thick chains. Fear coiled around her throat, making it hard to breathe. A soft whimper reached her ears. Elena forced her heavy eyelids open. There were others. At least a dozen women sat huddled against the grimy walls of what looked like a basement or a holding cell. Their faces were pale, streaked with tears. Some had bruises. Others just stared blankly, too broken to cry. A single overhead light buzzed, casting dim illumination over the horror before her. "Elena," a voice whispered. She turned, eyes widening. It was Mia, a girl from her college, a girl she hadn't seen in nearly a year. Her lip was split, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to disappear. Maya? Elena rasped, throat raw. What? Maya shook her head violently. Don't ask. Just don't. Elena's mind was still sluggish, struggling to piece things together. But then the cold truth hit her. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a mugging gone wrong. She had been taken. And these women, they had been here longer. Before she could process the nightmare she had woken into, the heavy iron door creaked open. Boots echoed against the concrete. Two men stepped inside, flanking an older man with silver-streaked hair and a face carved from stone. His tailored suit was pristine, his shoes polished to perfection, a stark contrast to the filth surrounding him. He scanned the room with the eyes of a predator, assessing his merchandise. A billionaire, a buyer, a trafficker. Elena felt sick. He smirked. Ah, our newest arrival is awake. He stopped in front of her, tilting his head. Lovely. Elena refused to cower. She met his gaze, swallowing down the terror rising in her throat. The man chuckled. Feisty. The buyers will like that. Buyers. Her stomach dropped. What? What is this? She forced out. The man smiled. An opportunity, my dear, for someone very rich and very powerful to own something. Unique? No. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. You will fetch a fine price. The door swung open again. A younger man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in all black. His presence suffocated the room. His gaze flickered over the women, unreadable. Elena Carter, the older man announced, stepping aside. Our most coveted auction piece tonight. The newcomer's expression didn't change. He walked toward her, movement slow, deliberate. Elena's entire body tensed. He stopped just inches from her, his piercing gaze boring into her like he could see straight through her. He lifted a single hand, and then, to her horror, he touched her face. A gentle caress, like a man inspecting something he already owned. Elena shuddered. The older man smiled. Shall we start the bidding? The nightmare had only just begun. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled against the chains binding her wrists. The metal was cold, biting into her skin, but she didn't care. She had to get out. She had to get out. She had to fight. The older man, the one who had called her the most coveted auction piece, watched her with amusement. His eyes glinted with something sick, something cruel. You can struggle all you want, darling, he said smoothly, but it won't change your fate. Elena glared at him. Go to hell. His lips curled into a smirk. Oh, my dear, you still think you have a choice. He gestured to the guards standing at the door. One of them stepped forward, reaching for her. Elena kicked out, catching him in the shin. The man barely flinched. Instead, he retaliated with a swift backhand across her face. Pain exploded through her cheek, her head snapping to the side. She tasted blood. A soft gasp echoed through the room. She wasn't sure if it came from Maya or one of the other captives, but she could feel their fear. The older man sighed. shaking his head. Such a shame, he mused. The beautiful ones always fight the hardest. Elena's breaths came fast and shallow, her pulse a thunderous roar in her ears. She wanted to lunge at him, claw his eyes out, but her body wouldn't stop shaking. The tall man dressed in black, the one who had touched her face like she was an object, watched her in silence. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something dark and calculating. Then, finally, he spoke. "When does the auction begin?" His voice was deep, quiet, controlled. The older man grinned. "Soon. The buyers are waiting." He turned back to Elena. "Get her ready." The guards moved at once. Elena thrashed, but they were too strong. Hands gripped her arms, yanked her up, and forced her toward the exit. She fought, kicked, screamed, but it was useless. Maya's voice rang out behind her, desperate and pleading. "Elena." She didn't hear the rest. The door slammed shut, cutting her off. She was dragged down a long, dimly lit hallway. The air smelled of cigarettes, sweat, and expensive cologne. Then they shoved her into a different room. She barely had time to take in her surroundings before she was pushed onto a chair and restrained. Two women, dressed in white like some twisted version of nurses, approached her. "What? What are you doing?" she demanded, trying to jerk away. They didn't answer. One of them pulled out a syringe. Elena's blood ran cold. "No, no, don't." She struggled violently, but strong hands held her down. The needle pierced her skin. A burning sensation spread through her veins. She gasped, eyes wide, body betraying her. Within seconds, she couldn't move. She could still see, hear, feel, but her limbs were paralyzed. A scream built in her throat, but she couldn't force it out. She was trapped in her own body, helpless. One of the women tilted her chin up, examining her. "She's perfect," she murmured. "A rare one." Elena wanted to slap her, to scream at her, to do anything, but she was frozen. Her head was tilted from side to side, her body examined like merchandise. Then they began preparing her. She was stripped down to nothing. A warm cloth ran over her skin, washing away the grime from the cell. They brushed her hair, applied soft perfume, and painted her lips a soft, innocent pink. The contrast between the gentle treatment and the horror of her situation made her stomach turn. She had never felt so violated, so powerless. Then, the final touch. A long silk dress was draped over her body, smooth and delicate. It was white, pure. Elena wanted to vomit, but she couldn't even move her fingers. One of the women smiled, running a hand over her hair. "There, now she's ready." The guards lifted her up, placing her into a wheelchair. The paralysis made her limbs limp and useless. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. Then she was wheeled out, down the hallway, through another door, into a grand, opulent room. The sound of voices, laughter, and clinking glasses filled the air. Elena's breath hitched. There were dozens of people, men in tailored suits sitting in luxurious leather chairs, holding paddles with numbers. It looked like a high-class event, a charity gala. Except this was no charity. This was an auction for human lives. A stage stood at the front of the room, and one by one the women were brought up and sold. The first girl fetched 1 million, the second 1.5. Elena wanted to scream, but she was locked inside her own body. Then her turn came. She was wheeled onto the stage, placed under harsh golden lights. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, our final item of the night, the crown jewel of this collection. A murmur ran through the room. Elena could feel hungry eyes devouring her. She's exquisite. I want her. I'll pay any price. The auctioneer smirked. We'll start the bidding at $1 million. A paddle shot up. 1 million. Another. 1.5. Elena's breathing shallowed. 2 million. The numbers kept climbing. 3. 4. She felt sick. Then, 5 million, a voice said. The entire room fell silent. Elena felt the air shift. Her eyes darted toward the bidder. And there he was, the man in black, the one who had touched her face, the one who had watched her with that quiet, dangerous gaze. Damien Blackwood. The auctioneer's voice shook with excitement. 5 million! Going once! Going twice! Silence. Then, sold! A gavel slammed down. A wave of applause. And just like that, Elena Carter was no longer a free woman. She belonged to him. Elena couldn't move. Her mind was still screaming, still fighting, but her body remained frozen. She sat stiffly in the chair, staring ahead as the world blurred around her. The sound of applause echoed in her ears like distant thunder. The gavel had fallen. She had been sold. $5 million. She had no idea what that number was supposed to mean. Was it high? Low? Did it make her more valuable? Did it make her more valuable than the others? Did it make her worth something to the man who had just bought her? Her stomach twisted. He owned her now. A wave of nausea crawled up her throat, but she forced it down. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't let them see her shatter. A hand touched her shoulder. Elena Carter, the auctioneer said, his voice smug. You're in for a very privileged life. Her privileged life. Her prison. A new set of hands gripped the arms of the wheelchair, and she was pushed forward, through the crowd, past the greedy gazes of men who had wanted her but lost. She caught glimpses of wealthy patrons sipping champagne, their conversations resuming as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just witnessed the selling of human beings. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were monsters, but her voice was still trapped inside her. The wheels rolled smoothly over the polished floor. She was taken down a long corridor, dimly lit with chandeliers that cast golden light on the walls. Then, a door. Her heart hammered. She was wheeled inside. The air changed immediately. The scent of cigars and expensive cologne filled her lungs. The space was luxurious but suffocating. And there, standing with his back to her, was him, the man who had bought her, the one in black, Damien Blackwood. His presence suffocated the room, as if the air itself bowed to him. Elena Carter, the auctioneer announced proudly. Damien didn't turn immediately. He stood still, hands in his pockets, his head slightly tilted, as if he were considering something. Then, finally, he turned. His eyes met hers. Dark, cold, unforgiving. Elena's breath caught. He was intimidating. Not just because of his towering frame or the way his sharp suit fit his broad shoulders like a second skin. It was his silence. The way he watched her, studying her like a puzzle he already knew how to solve. Then, in one slow, deliberate motion, he stepped forward. The auctioneer, despite his confidence, shifted uncomfortably. "Would you like to inspect her, Mr. Blackwood?" he asked. Damien's gaze flickered to the man sharply. "No," he said flatly. Elena's fingers twitched. The drug was wearing off. She could feel tingles in her hands, the faintest spark of control returning to her body. The auctioneer seemed to take the rejection in stride. "Very well. She's been prepared to your liking. The transfer has been processed. Would you like her sent to your estate now?" A beat of silence. "No." Elena's stomach dropped. "I'll take her myself," Damien said. The auctioneer hesitated. "That's—" Damien turned his head slightly, and the room shifted with the movement. Even without words, the power he wielded was absolute. The auctioneer swallowed. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood." Damien's gaze settled back on her. Elena. Her name on his lips sent a shiver through her spine. Not Carter. Not the girl. Her name. He said it with certainty, like he had already decided everything for her. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The guards tensed. "You don't need those." The auctioneer chuckled nervously. "She's docile. The drug is still in her system." Damien didn't look away from her. He crouched down, his face level with hers. Elena's breathing hitched. Up close, she could see the sharpness of his features, the chiseled jaw, the faint shadow of stubble, the scar barely visible beneath his left eye. "I don't trust things that look docile," he murmured. "A warning." He reached for her wrists, fastened the cuffs. Metal against skin. Cold. Binding. Final. He didn't say another word as he stood, didn't acknowledge the silent war waging inside her. He simply turned, nodding toward the exit. "Let's go." Elena's body was moving before she could resist, pulled to her feet. She wobbled, her legs weak, but she didn't fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She clenched her jaw and followed. Through the corridor, past the auction house, out into the night. A black car awaited them. A guard opened the back door. Elena hesitated. Damien's voice was calm, controlled. "You have two choices," he said. She turned to face him. His dark eyes were unreadable. "You get in," he said, "or I put you in." A challenge. Elena's fingers curled into fists. For a split second, she considered running. But the guards, the auction house, the cameras watching from every angle, she'd never make it. So instead, she stepped in, on her own. A small, silent act of defiance. Damien slid in beside her. The doors closed. The engine purred to life. And just like that, Elena Carter disappeared into the night, into his world, into the hands of a man she didn't understand. But she would. Soon, the car moved through the city streets in near silence, the hum of the engine a low vibration against Elena's skin. She sat stiffly in the back seat, wrists bound by cold steel, every nerve in her body on high alert. She refused to look at the man beside her, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Damien Blackwood exuded power, the kind that wasn't spoken but felt, the kind that owned the room without demanding attention. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Outside, the city lights flickered past in a blur, neon reflections dancing against the tinted glass. She had lived in this city her whole life, but it had never felt so unreachable. She was disappearing, and no one would know. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. She had to escape, somehow, but for now, she had to wait. The car took a sharp turn, and she finally broke the silence. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice came out hoarse. Damien didn't glance at her. "Somewhere safer than where you were." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Oh, how generous of you." He didn't react. That infuriated her more. "You paid $5 million for me," she continued, her voice dripping with venom. "That's an awfully big price tag for something you plan to keep safe." Now, he looked at her. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. "I don't waste money," he said simply. Elena swallowed hard. That answer should have scared her. Maybe it did. She turned away, staring out the window again. She could see the buildings thinning out, the city fading behind them. They were leaving. Panic coiled in her chest. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time. Damien took his time before answering. "My estate." Elena clenched her teeth. That told her nothing. The car drove on for miles. The lights of the city disappeared completely, replaced by endless stretches of darkness. No traffic, no signs of civilization, just the distant glow of a mansion appearing on the horizon. A fortress. She could make out the silhouette of tall iron gates, the flash of security cameras. No way out. By the time the car rolled to a stop, she had convinced herself of one thing. She was trapped. The driver stepped out first. Then Damien. She didn't move. He turned, expression unreadable. "Get out." Elena hesitated. She knew what would happen if she didn't. And she refused to let him drag her out like some helpless thing. With stiff movements, she stepped onto the gravel driveway. The air was cool, silent. The mansion loomed in front of her. Massive, dark, intimidating. Every window was tinted black, reflecting nothing. A house with secrets. Damien walked ahead, unconcerned whether she followed. The moment she hesitated, she felt a hand on her back. A guard. Her skin crawled. She stepped forward on her own, through the front doors, into his world. The interior was everything she expected: elegant, cold, suffocating. A place that looked like luxury but felt like a prison. The floors gleamed under the soft golden lighting. The ceilings stretched high, the air filled with the faintest scent of cigar smoke and leather. Damien strode through the space like he owned everything in it. Because he did! A woman in a black dress appeared from the shadows. Her posture was stiff, her expression neutral. "Prepare the guest room," Damien instructed. Elena's stomach twisted. Guest room? So he didn't plan to. She shook the thought away. The woman nodded and disappeared. Damien turned to her. "Come with me." She didn't move. His eyes darkened. "Elena," it wasn't a request. She followed. They moved down a long corridor, each step an echo in the silence. At the end of the hall, a door swung open, revealing a room far too beautiful for someone like her. It was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the vast estate. A king-size bed sat against one wall, its sheets untouched. A sitting area, a fireplace, a balcony. It was a prison wrapped in silk and luxury. Elena crossed her arms, lifting her chin. So what now? Damien leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You sleep." She let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, sure. I'll just cozy up in my new cage and pretend this is completely normal." His expression didn't change. "I didn't bring you here to hurt you, Elena." She glared at him. "Then why am I here?" Damien was silent for a long moment. Then, softer than she expected, "I don't know yet." That answer shook her more than anything. Before she could respond, he turned, stepping back into the hallway. The door closed behind him, and the lock clicked. Elena exhaled slowly. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. A cage was still a cage, no matter how beautifully decorated. She glanced around the room, looking for any weakness. The windows were reinforced glass. The door? Solid wood. No easy way out. Her gaze landed on the balcony. She moved toward it, pushing open the doors. The night air hit her, crisp and cold. She stepped forward, looking down. The drop was too high. Even if she survived, she wouldn't make it past the fence, the guards, the cameras. Damien had thought of everything. Her chest tightened. No, she wouldn't accept this. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be a way out, and she would find it. She swore it, even if it killed her. Elena didn't sleep. She lay on the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every tick of the clock on the wall felt like a countdown, a reminder that she was losing time. She needed to act, to think, to escape. The luxury of the room was suffocating. The silk sheets, the warm glow of the fireplace, the faint scent of cedar, and something darker, something uniquely him, all of it felt like a twisted illusion, a prison wrapped in wealth. Her body was exhausted, aching from the drug, from the struggle, from the sheer helplessness of being here. But her mind was sharp. She sat up, testing the boundaries of her cage. The windows reinforced, the doors locked, the walls too thick to break through. But there was one weakness: the balcony. The drop was high, but if she could climb down. Her heart pounded at the thought. She moved quickly, pushing the heavy curtains aside, stepping out into the cold night air. Below, the ground looked farther than she had hoped. Maybe 2 stories. A fall like that could break something, could get her killed. But staying here, that would kill her slowly. She gripped the railing, steadying her breath. If she climbed over, held onto the ledge, maybe she could lower herself down far enough to minimize the fall. A deep voice shattered the silence. "You're not that reckless." Elena froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned slowly. Damien Blackwood stood just inside her room, leaning against the doorframe. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were not. They were locked on her, unblinking, unamused, like a predator watching prey. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She forced herself to stay still, to hold his gaze. "I wasn't trying to escape," she lied. His lips ticked up slightly, the closest thing to a smirk. "Elena," he said, his voice smooth, dangerous. "Don't insult my intelligence." He stepped forward. Elena's fingers tightened on the balcony railing, instinct telling her to run. But where? She was trapped either way. Damien stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me something." She didn't answer. He didn't care. "Were you really willing to jump?" She swallowed. Hard. The air felt heavier, charged with something unnamed, unreadable. His eyes scanned her face, searching for something, something only he understood. She clenched her jaw. "I don't belong here." Damien exhaled slowly. "That's not the question I asked." Elena's pulse thundered. She hated this game, this push and pull. The way he never raised his voice, never threatened her outright, yet still had complete control. It was worse than fear. It was powerlessness. He took another step, closing the distance until she could smell him. Clean, dark, like wood smoke and control. His voice dipped lower, quieter. "If you'd rather break your bones than stay under my roof." Elena's stomach twisted. He was serious. He was calling her bluff. The night air bit at her skin, but her blood burned hot. She held his stare, refusing to look away. Seconds stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then he smirked, a slow, knowing, infuriating smirk. She hated him, hated that he saw through her, hated that he was right. Elena didn't jump. Instead, she turned, stepping back inside with stiff, controlled movements. Damien watched her, amusement flickering in his gaze. He said nothing as she walked past him, as if she had just given him an answer, as if she had just lost something. He followed her into the room, pausing near the door. Then, just as she was about to crawl back into bed, his voice cut through the silence. "Don't try that again." Elena's hands curled into fists. Or what? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, it was softer than she expected. You won't like the consequences. And then he was gone. The door closed. The lock clicked. She let out a shaky breath. Her knees felt weak. She sat down, pressing her fingers into her temples. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She would find another way. Because no matter what Damien Blackwood thought, she wasn't his to keep. Elena barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of the auction, of the way Damien's voice cut through the chaos, ending the bidding war with a single, commanding bid. 5 million, like she was nothing more than an object to be purchased. The memory made her stomach twist. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, it didn't last long. A loud knock at her door jolted her awake. She shot up, her heart hammering against her ribs. The door swung open without permission. A woman in a crisp black dress entered, her face neutral, but her posture rigid. A servant. "Good morning," she said coolly. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you for breakfast." Elena's pulse spiked. Her first instinct was to refuse, to dig her heels in. But she wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't a request. So she forced herself to breathe, to stay composed, and nodded. She wasn't going to play into their game. She would keep control where she could. The woman led her through the massive estate, down an elegant staircase lined with dark wood and gold accents. The mansion was eerily silent, too pristine, like it was meant to impress but never truly lived in. Finally, they reached a dining room so large it felt excessive. And there he was. Damien sat at the head of a long polished mahogany table, reading the morning paper, a cup of black coffee resting near his fingers. He didn't look up right away, as if she wasn't worth acknowledging. That alone made her fists clench. Elena was not invisible. She sat down at the farthest seat from him. The quiet clink of silverware was the only sound in the room. Then, finally, he spoke. "You didn't try to escape again." Elena stiffened. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. She hated that he was watching her so closely. She lifted her chin. "I'm not stupid." His lips ticked up slightly, barely there, but enough to infuriate her. "Good." He folded the paper and set it aside, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Eat." She didn't move. Damien tilted his head slightly. "Do you think I poisoned your food?" Elena's jaw tightened. "I don't know what men like you do." His gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Men like me." He repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. "Tell me, Elena, what kind of man do you think I am?" She exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table. "You bought me." The words felt like acid on her tongue. They should have made him flinch, should have made him feel something. But he didn't even blink. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, infuriatingly calm. Then, after a long pause, "Yes," he admitted. Elena's stomach twisted painfully. No denial. No sugarcoating it. Just truth. Something about that made her even angrier. He wasn't playing the villain who pretended to be good. He knew exactly what he was. Her voice shook. Then what do you want from me? Damien sat back in his chair. I don't know yet. That was the second time he had said it, and it terrified her more than if he had given a clear answer. Because men like him always had plans, and if he didn't know yet, it meant he was figuring it out, figuring her out. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. You don't have to keep me here. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Something sharp. You think it's that simple? He said quietly. Elena held her ground. I think if you actually wanted to let me go, you would. A long silence stretched between them. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. Then, finally, Damien spoke. You look like her. Elena froze. Her stomach dropped. Like who? The air in the room shifted. Damien's gaze was distant now, his fingers tapping idly against his coffee cup. For the first time, he seemed elsewhere. But only for a second. Then, just as quickly, he shook the thought away, his eyes sharpening once more. Eat, he said again. This time, his voice was final. Elena hesitated, but she picked up her fork because, for now, she had to survive. Elena didn't know how it started. Maybe it was the silence, the thick, suffocating air between them, the way Damien watched her without saying much, without explaining why she was here, why he hadn't done anything yet. It wasn't kindness. She wasn't stupid enough to believe that. Men like him didn't buy women for nothing. And yet, for days, that was exactly what happened. Nothing. He kept her inside the mansion, surrounded by walls, security cameras, locked doors. But he never touched her, never made any demands. It was worse than outright cruelty, because it left her in limbo, trapped between fear and confusion. She spent her time pacing the grand halls, studying every exit, every window, every blind spot she could find. It wasn't much. The mansion was a fortress, and Damien was careful, too careful, which meant she needed to be smarter. The first time he laid a hand on her, it wasn't to hurt her. It wasn't even intentional. They had crossed paths in the hallway, him heading toward his office, her attempting to explore the parts of the house she wasn't supposed to. She brushed past him, moving too quickly, and his fingers caught her wrist. It was barely a touch. But the moment it happened, something shifted. Elena froze. So did he. A single second stretched between them, thick with something unnamed. His grip was firm, warm, controlled, like he was holding something fragile, but wasn't sure if he wanted to break it or let it go. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. And then, just as quickly, he released her. Elena stumbled back. Damien said nothing. Didn't apologize. Didn't explain. He just kept walking, like nothing had happened. But something had. She felt it. A shift, a crack in the ice, and it terrified her, because she wasn't sure which one of them had caused it. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid, but because she was angry. At him. At herself. At the fact that part of her wasn't as afraid as she should be. Damien was dangerous. A man who had bought her, stolen her freedom, locked her away. And yet, he hadn't hurt her. Not in the ways she had expected. Not yet. She hated that small voice in the back of her head whispering why. Why wasn't he doing anything? What was he waiting for? She told herself she didn't care. But it was a lie. She was waiting too. For the moment he finally showed his true colors. For the moment she could finally hate him without hesitation. The second time he touched her, it was different. It was intentional. She had been standing by the balcony doors, staring out into the darkness, thinking, plotting, planning. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't noticed his presence until he was right behind her. Too close. His warmth pressed against her back, his breath fanning across her skin as he leaned down and whispered, "What are you thinking about?" Elena's body locked up. She swallowed hard, refusing to move, refusing to let him know what his proximity did to her. She kept her voice steady. "Cole, none of your business," Damien hummed, low and deep. "You're planning something." It wasn't a question. Elena forced herself to breathe evenly. "What makes you say that?" His fingers brushed her waist. Just barely. Not enough to be forceful, but enough to be a warning. "Because I know you," he murmured. Elena's skin prickled. She hated the way his voice curled around her like velvet lined with steel. "You don't know me," she snapped. Damien chuckled softly, dark and amused. "You think I don't?" His fingers finally retreated, but the damage was already done. Elena felt shaken, because for a brief, fleeting second, she hadn't hated his touch. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Elena waited until the house was silent. She had spent days watching, learning the routines, paying attention to the guards, the way Damien moved, the way the staff avoided eye contact. She wasn't stupid. Every step she took in this house was monitored. Every glance she stole at a window, every hesitant step toward a door. He saw it all. But tonight, she had an advantage. Damien was gone. She didn't know where, didn't know why, but she had overheard one of the staff mentioning it earlier. Something about a business deal, something that required him to leave the estate for the night. This was her chance. The thought made her blood rush faster, her hands tighten into fists. She had no plan, no resources, but she had a window of time, and that was enough. She dressed quickly, opting for dark clothing, something easy to move in. Every instinct screamed that she was being too reckless, that she should wait, prepare, think this through. But there was no time for caution, because if she stayed here any longer, if she let herself fall into the rhythm of this place, into the strange, twisted routine Damien was weaving around her, she might never leave. Elena cracked the door open. The hallway was empty. Good. She moved fast, her footsteps light against the marble. Down the hall, past the main staircase. She knew the main entrance was impossible. Too many guards, too many locks, too many eyes watching. But the West Wing balcony. She had seen the layout of the estate from the windows. If she could get down from the second floor, she could make it across the yard, slip through the gardens. A plan formed in her mind as she moved. Her heart pounded against her ribs, adrenaline fueling her limbs, every muscle tense and ready to run. She was almost there. Almost. Going somewhere? The voice froze her. Cold, amused, too familiar. Elena's blood ran ice cold. She turned slowly. And there he was, Damien, standing at the end of the hall, hands in his pockets, eyes too knowing, too calm. He hadn't left. He had let her think he had. She clenched her jaw, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run. But she didn't move, because she already knew. She wouldn't make it. Not now. Not anymore. He took a step toward her, slow, deliberate. Elena. Her name was a warning, a blade sliding between her ribs. Her fingers twitched. She had seconds to decide, fight or surrender. So she ran, not toward him, toward the balcony. If she could just make it. Strong arms caught her mid-step. Her body slammed into his chest, her momentum crushed beneath his unshakable grip. Elena, he murmured against her hair, voice low, controlled, unyielding. Let me go, she hissed, struggling violently, twisting, kicking, thrashing against him. He didn't flinch, didn't even stumble. Let me go, Damien. No. The single word was a death sentence. One of his arms wrapped around her waist, the other gripping her wrist, pinning it to his chest. His heartbeat was steady, calm. Like this wasn't a struggle. Like this wasn't a fight he was ever going to lose. Her breath came fast and sharp. She tried to bite, claw, hit. But he was too strong, too collected. Chew, he whispered, softer this time, like he was soothing a frightened animal. Her chest heaved. Tears of frustration burned behind her eyes. She had failed. She had been so close. Her body sagged against his in defeat, and only then did his grip loosen, just slightly. She hated the way he held her like this, like she was his, like she would never get away. He exhaled slowly, his breath warm against her temple. I told you, he murmured. You won't like the consequences. Elena shut her eyes. She knew that now. Elena's breathing was ragged as she sagged against Damien's hold, every muscle trembling from the exertion of trying to escape him. He had caught her so easily, too easily, like he had been expecting this all along. And maybe he had. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding in a chaotic mess. She had no plan now, no backup, nothing. He owned this moment, and he knew it. Damien exhaled, his grip still firm but no longer crushing. He held her like he was waiting for something, waiting for her to fight again, to push back, to prove that she was still burning with defiance. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Slowly, he turned her to face him. Her heart thundered, her skin electric with anger and fear. His hands were still on her, one pressing against her lower back, the other wrapped around her wrist. Dark eyes met hers, unreadable, calculating. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stand taller, even though she felt small beneath his stare. "What now?" she asked, her voice sharp, biting. He studied her, his fingers tightening just slightly, barely noticeable, but she felt it. "Now," he said evenly, "you learn." Elena hated the way his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "Learn what?" she snapped. His gaze darkened, his thumb brushing over the inside of her wrist. An absent, almost casual touch, but it made her heart pound harder. "That I always win." Her breath hitched. She jerked her wrist free, but he let her go. She stepped back, needing distance, needing air. Damien watched her, completely calm, completely in control. "You don't have to make this difficult," he said smoothly. Elena let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You kidnapped me, locked me in your house, and you want me to just, what, accept it?" Damien didn't flinch. "You weren't safe out there." The words sent a shock of anger through her. She took a step forward, her chest heaving. "And I'm safe with you?" A beat of silence. Then, his voice, low, certain. "Yes." Elena's throat tightened. He said it like a fact, like an unshakable truth. And what terrified her the most, what made her fists curl at her sides, was that she almost believed him. She hated herself for that. She hated him for that. A long, tense silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Damien sighed. "I won't lock your door anymore." Elena's head snapped up. Shock flickered through her. "What? What?" He tilted his head slightly. "You want freedom?" His voice was quieter now. "Then take it." Her heart pounded. There had to be a trick. A test. She narrowed her eyes. "And what happens if I try to leave?" Damien's lips curved into something dangerous. "You won't." Elena swallowed. And for the first time since she had been dragged into this world, she wasn't sure if he was wrong. Elena didn't believe him. She couldn't. Damien Blackwood had spent weeks keeping her locked in this place, watching her every move, making it clear that she was his possession, his property, his prize. And now, suddenly, he was offering her freedom. It was a trick. It had to be. She stayed rooted to the spot, studying him carefully. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed, too relaxed. His dark eyes held no challenge, no warning, but there was something beneath the surface, something unreadable. "You're lying," she said, keeping her voice steady. He exhaled softly, like she was exhausting him. Her fists clenched at her sides. "Then let me go." His gaze never wavered. "The door is unlocked." Her stomach twisted. This was wrong. Too easy. Too simple. She moved toward the door, keeping her eyes on him, waiting for him to stop her, grab her, do something. But he didn't move. She reached the handle. It was cool against her palm. Unlocked. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The hallway stretched ahead, empty, dark, silent. No guards. No locked doors. The exit to the mansion was just down the staircase. Her heart pounded. This is it. She took one step out. Then another. Still, Damien didn't move. No footsteps behind her. No warnings. She forced herself to keep walking. Her pace quickened as she descended the grand staircase, her bare feet silent against the cold marble. This was real. She was actually leaving. She reached the front door and pulled it open, expecting resistance. Nothing. Cool night air hit her skin. She stepped outside. Deep breath. Another step. The gravel crunched beneath her as she moved across the driveway toward the main gate, toward freedom. Then she stopped. Her entire body froze, because standing just beyond the estate's iron gates, leaning against a sleek black car, was Vincent Blackwood, Damien's brother. Her stomach twisted violently. Vincent's smirk was lazy, amused, but his eyes were sharp, full of something dangerous and dark. "You finally made it out," he drawled, straightening. Elena took a step back. The moment she did, Vincent let out a low, mocking laugh. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, shaking his head. "Where do you think you're gonna run?" She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. Something about him felt more unstable, more unpredictable than Damien, more dangerous. "I don't belong here," she forced out. Vincent grinned. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "Then why do you still look like a lost little pet?" Elena's fingernails bit into her palms. "I'm not anyone's pet." Vincent tilted his head. "You sure about that?" She tried not to let him see how much his words unsettled her. He was playing with her, testing her. Then his smirk faded. His voice dropped. "You think my brother's the worst thing that could happen to you?" The question sent a chill down her spine. Vincent leaned in slightly, his voice a quiet, mocking whisper. "You should be thanking him for keeping you on a leash." Elena's stomach flipped, because for the first time since she'd been here, since the auction, since Damien had bought her, since she'd been locked away in his mansion, she realized something. There were men far, far worse than Damien Blackwood. And one of them was standing right in front of her. She didn't answer. Didn't move. Vincent's smirk returned, slow and knowing. "Smart girl," he murmured. Then, the sound of slow footsteps. Elena knew before she even turned who it was. "Damien!" He walked toward them with measured, controlled steps, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were locked on Vincent like a loaded gun. Vincent didn't flinch. "Brother," he greeted lazily. "You let her out, that's new." Damien didn't answer, didn't break stride. When he reached them, he stepped in front of Elena, positioning himself between her and Vincent. His voice was low, calm, deadly. "She's not your concern." Vincent let out a soft chuckle, but there was something cold behind it. "She's a liability," he said, tilting his head. "You know that, don't you?" Damien's expression remained stone cold. "I know exactly what she is." Elena's breath caught. She hated how she wasn't sure what that meant. Vincent studied him, then shifted his gaze to her. "Maybe," he murmured. "But what happens when she figures it out too?" Then, without another word, He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. Her body felt rigid, frozen, like she was standing on a thin sheet of ice that could crack at any second. She turned to Damien, barely able to catch her breath. "What was that?" she demanded. He looked at her, his face unreadable, his expression calm, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. "A reminder," he said quietly. Elena swallowed hard. "A reminder of what?" His eyes locked onto hers. "Why you can't leave." She hated that she understood what he meant, and she hated even more that he might be right. Elena stood frozen in place, Damien's words ringing in her ears. "Why you can't leave." She wanted to deny it, to scream at him that he was wrong, that she could walk away, that she would walk away. But the weight of Vincent's presence, the cold amusement in his gaze, the way he had looked at her like she was prey in a cage, with the door cracked open, just enough to give her false hope. It had shaken her. Damien had known. He had let her walk right to the edge of her so-called freedom just to show her that it wasn't real. That out there was worse. Her breath came fast and uneven as she took a step back, her head spinning. "You," she swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper. "You wanted me to see him." Damien's gaze was unreadable, but he didn't deny it. Her stomach twisted, a mix of rage and something dangerously close to understanding warring inside her. She had been so desperate to run, so sure that anything was better than this prison Damien had built around her. And yet, one encounter with Vincent had sent doubt slamming into her ribs like a freight train. She clenched her fists, hating herself for the way her body had tensed when Vincent had looked at her, for the way Damien's presence had felt like a shield instead of a threat. Damien turned without a word, heading back inside, like he knew she would follow, like she had already made her choice. Elena stayed frozen for a moment longer, standing under the open night sky, the cold air biting at her skin. This was the first time she had been outside since the auction. And yet, the air didn't feel free. It felt heavy, like even the world beyond the gates wasn't hers to take. She hated him for being right, but she hated herself more for knowing it. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, following Damien's retreating figure back inside. The massive front door shut behind her with a quiet but final click. And she didn't fight it. She didn't try to escape again. Days passed, slow and heavy, marked only by the steady rhythm of a new reality sinking into her bones. Damien kept his word. Her door remained unlocked. She could move freely around the estate, wander through the halls, step out onto the balconies. She could have left at any time, but she didn't. Not because she trusted him, not because she had accepted her fate, but because she didn't know what waited beyond those gates anymore. She had thought the worst thing that could happen to her was being bought. But now she wasn't so sure. Damien had given her a choice. Stay or leave, knowing what was out there. And that was worse than any cage. Because now if she stayed, it would be because she had chosen to. One evening she found herself in the study, staring at the bookshelves lining the walls. She didn't know what had drawn her there. Maybe the silence. Maybe the illusion of normalcy. She had once been a college student, drowning in textbooks, balancing her life between bartending and chasing a future that felt like a different lifetime now. And now she was here, a prisoner without chains. Damien entered the room behind her. She didn't turn, but she felt him. The air shifted, the way it always did when he was near. He walked to the desk, setting down a glass of whiskey, then leaned against the edge of the wooden surface, watching her. "You can take one," he said, his voice calm, measured. Elena hesitated. Then slowly, she reached out and pulled a book from the shelf. The simple act felt strange, like crossing an invisible line. She opened it, running her fingers over the worn pages, the scent of leather and paper filling her lungs. A reminder of the life she had before. Something inside her cracked. She shut the book and turned to face him. Her voice was quiet, but firm. Damien didn't react at first. Then he nodded. "All right." She blinked, caught off guard. "Just like that." "No arguments?" she challenged. "No conditions?" He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Just one." She crossed her arms. "Of course." His eyes darkened, a quiet, undeniable authority settling into his expression. "You work for me." Her pulse spiked. "What?" He took a slow sip of whiskey before setting the glass down. "You want school. You want freedom. You want a life beyond these walls." His gaze locked onto hers. "Then you earn it." A sharp silence stretched between them. It should have felt like another cage, another trap, but it didn't. Because this time, it was her choice. And for the first time since she had been taken, she had something to bargain with. Elena stared at Damien, his words sinking into her bones. "Then you earn it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a demand. It was a deal. And that made it more dangerous than anything he could have forced on her. Because now she had a choice. She could walk away, refuse whatever he was offering, spend the rest of her days trapped in this estate with no direction, no plan, no way forward. Or she could accept and let him pull her deeper into his world. She exhaled slowly, keeping her gaze locked on his. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. Damien studied her, his expression calm, too calm. "You'll assist me with business," he said smoothly. "Learn how things operate. Handle tasks I assign to you." Her stomach twisted. "You mean illegal business?" A slight smirk. "I mean my business." She hated that answer. Because it didn't tell her anything. Yet it told her everything. He was giving her just enough information to make her curious, just enough to make her consider it. She should have said no. She should have walked out of this room, out of this conversation, out of whatever trap he was laying for her. But instead, she asked, "And if I say yes?" Damien's smirk faded. Something darker flickered behind his gaze. Something serious, calculating. "Then I give you everything you need to build a future outside of here." Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. "A future?" outside, the very thing she had stopped believing in. It was bait. She knew that. But the worst part, she was tempted to take it. Damien leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the desk. You wanted power, he murmured. You wanted control. His voice dropped lower. I'm offering it to you. She felt it then, the shift between them, the change. This wasn't the same man who had bought her at the auction, the same man who had kept her locked in a gilded cage. This was a man offering her the key. If she was brave enough to take it. Elena exhaled sharply. She knew she was walking into something dangerous, something irreversible. But she also knew this was her only chance, her only way out. She met his gaze. I'll do it. Damien's expression didn't change. But something shifted in his eyes. Approval. Satisfaction. He extended his hand. Elena hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. His fingers curled around hers. Warm, firm, unshakable. And just like that, she wasn't just his captive anymore. She was his partner, his student, his pawn. And maybe, just maybe, she would learn how to beat him at his own game. Elena's journey is more than just a story of captivity, survival, and power. It's a lesson about choice, control, and the dangerous illusion of freedom. At the beginning, she believed that escape meant running away, that if she could just get past the gates, she would be free. But she learned the hard way that the world outside was just as dangerous, if not worse, than the cage she was trying to escape from. Sometimes, freedom isn't about running. It's about learning how to take control of your own fate. Damien was a man of power, influence, and manipulation. He never forced Elena to stay. He made her choose, and in doing so, he turned her from a victim into a player in his world. The real question is, did she win? Or did she simply become another version of him? This story teaches us that power isn't given, it's taken. Elena started as a captive, but ended as a woman who understood the rules of the game. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting. But the cost of power is always high. So, the question is, if you were in her position, what would you have done? Would you fight? Would you run? Or would you learn to play the game? Let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? And if you love stories that make you think, question, and feel, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new video. See you in the next story.